For 342 days, she held her vigil. Every sunrise painted her silhouette in the drawing-room window, a lonely figure watching the road for a messenger's horse. She waited for a letter, a single sheet of paper bearing his handwriting that would quiet the frantic beating of her heart. She prayed for ink and parchment, but the heavens answered with thunder and rain. On a night when the world seemed to be tearing itself apart, a rider finally came. But he was not a messenger. He was a Titan of a man, the one they called the Iron Duke, and he didn't bring a letter. He brought the storm with him. The year 1816 would be remembered by most as the year without a summer, a time of chilling rains and failed crops when the sky seemed perpetually bruised and weeping. But for Miss Eleanor Vance, it was the year of silence. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of the east-facing drawing-room of Blackwood Manor, its grand window a frame for her ceaseless vigil. From this perch, she could see the muddy ribbon of a road that snaked through the moors of Northumberland, the only artery connecting their remote estate to the rest of England. It was down this road that Lord Julian Ashworth had ridden away nearly a year ago, his blonde hair a flash of sunlight in a world that had not yet forgotten the sun. He had promised to write, every week. "I shall fill pages with my devotion, Eleanor," he had vowed, his blue eyes earnest as he clasped her hands. "My words will be a bridge between us until I can return and make you my wife." For the first 2 months, the bridge held strong. His letters arrived faithfully, carried by a weary rider, splattered with the mud of the Great North Road. They were filled with the bravado of a young officer stationed in the uneasy peace of post-war France. But beneath the descriptions of Parisian society and military drills, his affection for her was a steady, warming flame. She would read them by this very window, her fingers tracing his signature, her heart swelling with a love so profound it felt like the only true thing in a fractured world. Then the letters had dwindled, one a fortnight, then one a month. Now, for the past 4 months, there had been nothing. Not a word, not a line. The bridge of his words had collapsed, leaving her stranded on the shore of a terrible, silent sea. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass, the relentless patter of rain, a miserable accompaniment to the thoughts churning within her. She was a pale, quiet woman of 22, with raven-dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. Neighbors might have called her plain, but Julian had called her his starlit dusk, his serene harbor. Without him, she felt herself fading, becoming as grey and indistinct as the weather. "You will catch a chill, my dear," a soft voice said from behind her. Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper who had been more of a mother to her than her own ever was, standing with a shawl in her wrinkled hands. Her face, a road map of kind worries, was etched with concern. "The post rider is late today," Eleanor said. Though the words were a worn-out lie, they both politely upheld. The post rider hadn't been late. He had come and gone 3 days ago with nothing for the manor. "Perhaps the roads are washed out," Mrs. Gable offered, draping the heavy wool shawl over Eleanor's shoulders. "This rain is unnatural." Eleanor gave a weak smile and turned back to the window. The moors were a sodden sponge, the heather beaten down into a dark, bruised carpet. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of charcoal grey. Everything felt heavy, waterlogged, and hopeless. She had written to Julian, of course, frantic, pleading letters at first, then cooler, more measured inquiries, terrified of seeming like a shrew. Had he been injured? Was he ill? Had he simply forgotten her? The last thought was a cold stone in her stomach. Her father, Sir Reginald Vance, a man more interested in his ledgers and port than his daughter's heart, had declared the match with Julian Ashworth a triumph. Julian was the second son of a viscount, handsome, charming, and with a promising military career. But he was also under the command of a formidable and intimidating figure, Bryce Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. The Duke was a legend, a hero of the Napoleonic Wars whispered about in drawing rooms and taverns alike. He was called the Iron Duke for his unbending will and harsh discipline. They said he felt no fear, showed no mercy, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. He was Julian's commanding officer, and, by a strange twist of fate, their landlord. Blackwood Manor, Eleanor's home, was part of the vast, sprawling Beaumont estate, leased by her father for a pittance due to some old family connection. Eleanor had never met the Duke, and she prayed she never would. His name alone conjured images of a severe, granite-faced man who would have no time for the sentimental anxieties of a waiting woman. The afternoon light began to fail, the gloom outside deepening into a premature twilight. The rain, which had been a steady drumming, intensified, lashing against the window panes as if in a fury. A new sound joined the chorus, a low, mournful howl, the wind rising to a gale. "A proper tempest is brewing," Mrs. Gable murmured, lighting the oil lamps. The small flames pushed back the shadows, making the room a tiny island of warmth in the encroaching dark. "Lord, have mercy on any soul caught out in this." Eleanor's heart clenched. A soul caught out in this. A rider. A messenger. Still, she watched. Hope was a terminal illness, and she was in its final, agonizing stages. She watched as the wind tore at the ancient oaks lining the drive, their branches flailing like desperate arms. She watched until her eyes burned, and the window reflected only her own ghostly face, a prisoner of a promise that had seemingly been broken. The silence from France was a living thing now, a malevolent presence that sat with her in the dark and whispered her deepest fears into her ear. The storm did not just brew, it exploded. It was a biblical deluge, a maelstrom of wind and water that seemed intent on scouring the very stones of Blackwood Manor from their foundations. The windows rattled in their frames, and the distant, tormented groan of a falling tree echoed across the moor. Inside, Eleanor and Mrs. Gable sat by the fire, the flickering light casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Even Sir Reginald had emerged from his study, his usual gruff complacency replaced by a flicker of unease. "Damnable weather," he grumbled, pouring himself a larger-than-usual brandy. "The roof will be leaking in a dozen places by morning." Eleanor paid him no mind. Her senses were stretched to their limit, tuned to the chaos outside. Every shriek of the wind sounded like a cry. Every crash of thunder felt like a premonition. Her hope for a letter had curdled into a raw, primal fear. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. This storm felt like an omen, the physical manifestation of the turmoil in her soul. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she heard it. Through the roar of the gale, another sound. Faint at first, then growing steadily stronger. It was rhythmic, powerful, and utterly out of place in the tempest. Thump, 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 thump. "What is that?" Mrs. Gable asked, her knitting needles frozen in her hands. Sir Reginald lowered his glass. "What?" "Listen," Eleanor whispered, rising from her chair and moving back towards the window, her sanctuary and her prison. The sound grew louder, a relentless, churning beat that cut through the wind. A horse being ridden hard, not with the weary plod of the post-rider, but with the desperate, earth-devouring gallop of a man riding for his life, or something even more important. She strained to see, wiping the condensation from the glass with her sleeve. For a moment, there was nothing but the swirling blackness of the rain-swept night. Then, a flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, ghastly white. And she saw him, a lone rider on a colossal black stallion, a creature as dark and furious as the storm itself. The man was a giant, cloaked and hatless, his head bowed against the punishing wind. He and the horse moved as one, a terrifying apparition, charging through the deluge, straight towards the manor. "Good God!" Sir Reginald breathed, coming to stand beside her. Who in their right mind would be out on a night like this? Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady gallop of the approaching horse. It wasn't the post. It was something else. Something final. The rider didn't slow as he reached the gates, the stallion taking the low stone wall of the drive in a powerful leap. He thundered up the gravel path, the sound of the horse's hooves like cannon fire. He reined the great beast to a halt directly in front of the main door, the horse snorting and stamping, its breath pluming in the cold, wet air. The man swung himself down from the saddle. Even soaked and shadowed, his size was intimidating. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, a figure of raw power and unyielding strength. "See to the door, man," Sir Reginald barked at a trembling footman who had appeared in the hall. Eleanor couldn't move. She was transfixed by the figure outside. He stood for a moment, rain sluicing from his dark, drenched coat, and looked up. Not at the door, but directly at her window. She felt his gaze like a physical blow, a piercing, intense stare that seemed to see right through the glass, right through the rain, and into the terrified recesses of her heart. In that brief, illuminated moment, she saw his face, all hard angles and grim lines, a face carved from granite and fury. It was a face she had seen only in sketches in the London papers, the face of a warrior, the face of the Iron Duke. The heavy oak door groaned open. The wind howled through the house, extinguishing half the lamps in the hall. The footman was thrown back a step as the Duke of Blackwood entered their home, bringing the full, untamed fury of the storm in with him. He did not speak. He simply stood there in the entrance hall, water pooling around his formidable boots, his dark eyes sweeping over the suddenly silent, gaping household staff. His presence filled the space, dwarfing everything and everyone in it. He was not a guest. He was an invasion. Then his gaze found Eleanor, as she stood frozen at the entrance to the drawing room. He moved towards her, his stride measured and purposeful, each step an earthquake in her small, silent world. The waiting was over, and she knew, with a certainty that was colder and sharper than any shard of ice, that she would have preferred it to last an eternity. Duke Bryce Beaumont stood before her, a force of nature contained within the frame of a man. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair, tracing paths down his stern, weathered face. His coat, a fine make of dark wool, was ruined, clinging to a physique that spoke of years in the saddle and on the battlefield. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of steel, cold and utterly unreadable, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was exactly as she might have imagined it, deep, resonant, and devoid of any warmth. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Eleanor could only nod, her throat tight. Her father, finally recovering his senses, bustled forward, his face a mixture of awe and agitation. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor. To what do we owe this visit in such inclement weather?" The Duke's gaze did not waver from Eleanor. He seemed to look straight through her father as if he were a ghost. "My business is with your daughter, Sir Reginald. alone. The command was absolute. There was no room for argument. Sir Reginald, a man used to being the master of his own home, deflated instantly. He stammered, "Of course, Your Grace, of course." He motioned for Mrs. Gable and the other servants to withdraw, casting one last, worried glance at Eleanor, before retreating from the drawing-room and closing the doors, leaving them in a sudden, suffocating silence, broken only by the storm and the crackle of the fire. Bryce Beaumont moved past her, towards the hearth. He didn't ask for permission. He stripped off his soaked gloves and held his hands, long-fingered and powerful, towards the flames. He was not warming them. He seemed to be daring the fire to touch him. "You have been awaiting word from Lieutenant Ashworth," he stated, his back still to her. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "For months. Is he well?" The Duke turned slowly. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, making him look even more severe, more dangerous. "He is well." A wave of relief, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over Eleanor. He was alive. He was well. The 4 months of silent torture had been for nothing. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, a hand flying to her chest. "Why hasn't he written? Is he on some secret assignment? Is he unable to send post?" "He was able," the Duke said flatly. "He chose not to." The relief vanished, replaced by a sharp, cold confusion. "What? That cannot be. Julian promised." "Promises, Miss Vance," the Duke said, taking a step towards her, "are often broken in times of war and in times of peace that follow." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded piece of parchment. It was miraculously dry, protected by an oilskin pouch. It was not, however, sealed with Julian's familiar signet. "He asked me to deliver this to you in person," the Duke continued, his voice relentless. He felt a messenger was insufficient for the task. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the letter. Her fingers brushed against his, and she flinched from the unexpected warmth and calloused texture of his skin. The paper felt heavy in her hand, heavy with unspoken words, heavy with dread. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Julian's, but it was wrong, hasty. The elegant, sloping script she knew so well was jagged and stark. The words themselves were even worse. They were the cold, formal words of a stranger. "My dearest Eleanor, circumstances have changed in a manner I could not have foreseen. My duties, and indeed my affections, have found a new direction. It is with the deepest regret that I must end our engagement. It would be a disservice to us both to continue with a union that my heart can no longer honor. I wish you a future of happiness, yours, etc. J. Ashworth, yours, etc. The 2 words were a slap in the face. All their shared dreams, their whispered promises, their profound love, reduced to a casual, dismissive sign-off. The bridge of his words hadn't just collapsed. He had set fire to it himself. The letter slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. The room tilted, the firelight blurring into a smear of orange and yellow. A roaring sound filled her ears, louder than the storm outside. "I don't understand," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "A new direction, new affections. He loves me. He told me," the Duke cut in, his voice sharp, "that he has found a woman in Paris, a French comtesse. He intends to marry her." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. He delivered the killing blow without a flicker of emotion. Eleanor stared at him, at this cold, unfeeling monolith of a man who had ridden through a hurricane to shatter her life into 1,000,000 pieces. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you be the one to tell me this? Why not send one of his men?" "Because he is under my command," the Duke answered, his jaw tight. "His actions are a reflection on my regiment. And because," he paused, his steel-grey eyes holding hers, "he is a coward. He asked me to face the storm he did not have the courage to. I have done my duty. I shall take my leave." He turned to go, his grim's task completed. But as he did, Eleanor's shock gave way to a surge of white-hot anger. Anger at Julian. Anger at this insufferable, heartless Duke. "Your duty?" she cried, her voice ringing with sudden strength. "You ride into my home, destroy my future, and call it duty? You speak of courage? It takes no courage to deliver a blow to an unarmed woman, Your Grace. It is merely efficient." Bryce Beaumont stopped, his hand on the door handle. He did not turn around, but she saw the muscles in his back tense beneath his damp shirt. For a long moment, he was silent, the storm raging around them, mirroring the one that had just broken within her. Then, without looking back, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "The storm has not passed, Miss Vance. You would be wise to bar your doors." He opened the door and was gone, leaving her alone with the crackling fire, the howling wind, and the pieces of a letter that had destroyed everything. Eleanor stood frozen in the drawing room, the Duke's parting words hanging in the air like frost. The storm has not passed. What could that possibly mean? Was it a threat? A warning? Her mind, already reeling from Julian's betrayal, could not grasp it. She felt hollowed out, a fragile shell that might shatter at the slightest touch. The sound of her father's agitated voice in the hall brought her back. She heard him arguing with the Duke. "But Your Grace, it would be madness to ride out again in this. The bridge over the River Coquet will be flooded. You must stay the night. We insist. We have ample room." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, a bitter laugh catching in her throat. Her father, ever the sycophant, was offering hospitality to the man who had just dismantled his daughter's life. A moment later, the Duke reappeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous. Behind him, Sir Reginald hovered nervously. "It appears I am your guest until the storm abates," the Duke said, his voice clipped. It was clear the situation pleased him as little as it pleased her. Eleanor simply stared at him, her grief and anger a protective shield. "Mrs. Gable will show you to a room, Your Grace. I'm sure you will find the accommodations adequate." Her tone was glacial. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his steel-grey eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, more complex. He gave a curt nod and turned, allowing Mrs. Gable to lead him up the grand, creaking staircase. Eleanor was left alone once more. She bent down and picked up the letter, the cruel instrument of her heartbreak. She sank into the chair by the window, the same window where she had waited with such hope, and read the words again and again. The more she looked, the more a tiny, insistent detail pricked at her consciousness. The signature. J. Ashworth. Julian always signed his letters, "Your Julian." Always. And the loop of the J was too rigid, the H in Ashworth too sharp. It was his handwriting, yet it was not. It was like a skilled but soulless copy. But that was madness. Why would anyone forge a letter to break her heart? It was easier to believe Julian had simply changed, that the man she loved was gone, replaced by a cold stranger. She crumpled the letter in her fist, the sharp edges of the parchment digging into her palm. The night was an eternity. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to the storm and the creaks and groans of the old manor. The house felt different with him in it. His presence was a palpable weight, a pressure in the air. He was a predator in their midst, and she, the wounded prey. Morning came, not with light, but with a slight lessening of the oppressive dark. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, but the sky remained a uniform, miserable grey. Eleanor went downstairs to find a strange scene in the dining room. Her father was attempting to engage the Duke in conversation about politics, but Bryce Beaumont was a stone wall, giving only terse, monosyllabic answers as he consumed his breakfast with military efficiency. He looked up as Eleanor entered, and the room fell silent. He had been given dry clothes belonging to her father, but the garments were comically small on his large frame, the sleeves of the shirt ending halfway up his forearms. The sight did not lessen his intimidating aura. It only served to emphasize his raw, physical power. "Miss Vance?" he acknowledged with a nod. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. She took her seat and numbly accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Gable. She could feel his eyes on her, and it was an effort not to squirm under his scrutiny. "The bridge is out," her father announced with a sort of grim satisfaction. "The river is a torrent. You may be with us for some days, Your Grace." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My man will be looking for me. He'll have the devil's own luck finding his way here until the water recedes," Sir Reginald said cheerfully, oblivious to the suffocating tension. For 2 days, they were trapped. 2 days of strained meals, suffocating silences, and the constant, unnerving presence of the Duke. He was a restless guest. He prowled the house like a caged panther, his long strides eating up the length of the hallways. Eleanor found him in the library, not reading, but staring out at the rain-swept moors, his expression dark and brooding. She saw him in the stables, speaking in low tones to his massive black stallion, a creature that seemed to share its master's untamable spirit. During this time, Eleanor observed him. She saw the way his man, a quiet, wiry fellow named Corporal Jones, who had managed to arrive on the second day, looked at the Duke with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. She saw the subtle way the Duke's hand would rest on the hilt of the sabre that was never far from his side, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. And she noticed something else. He was watching her. Whenever he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch his gaze on her, and his expression was not one of cold indifference. It was one of intense, calculating assessment, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve, or a threat he was trying to neutralize. On the third evening, Eleanor was in the drawing room, listlessly trying to read a book of poetry. She couldn't focus. Julian's cruel words were burned into her mind. She still held the crumpled letter, now softened and worn from her constant handling. Smoothing it out on her lap, she stared again at the signature. It was wrong. She knew it. It was a small, irrational point of fixation, but it was the only thing her shattered mind could cling to. The door opened and the Duke entered. He had a decanter of brandy in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. He moved to the fire and set them down on the mantelpiece. "A storm of a different sort is brewing in your mind, Miss Vance," he said, without looking at her. "It is perhaps just as fierce as the one outside." "My mind is no concern of yours, Your Grace," she retorted. He poured 2 glasses and turned, holding one out to her. "Perhaps not. But Julian Ashworth was, and I do not believe for a second that you are the sort of woman to simply accept the words on that piece of paper." His perception was so startlingly accurate, it unnerved her. She stared at him, at the glass he offered. "And what sort of woman do you believe I am?" He held her gaze, his own eyes serious, the cold steel in them warmed slightly by the firelight. "The sort who trusts her instincts, the sort who knows when a man's handwriting is a lie, even if it looks like the truth. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat of suspicion and a wild, terrifying flicker of renewed hope. "He is in trouble, isn't he?" she whispered, her eyes searching his. "That's why you're here. The letter, it's a lie." The Duke did not answer immediately. He set down her glass and walked to the window, the very one where her vigil had begun. He stood with his back to her, a dark, imposing silhouette against the dying light. "Some truths, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble, "are more dangerous than any lie." The Duke's words hung in the air, thick with implication. It was a confession wrapped in a riddle, a confirmation that sent Eleanor's mind racing. The last 3 days of numb grief began to recede, replaced by a sharp, invigorating flood of adrenaline. Julian wasn't a callous traitor to their love. He was in danger. And this formidable, secretive man held the key. She rose from her chair, the crumpled letter still clutched in her hand, and approached him. Dangerous to whom? To him or to me? Bryce Beaumont turned from the window. His face was a mask of control, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a man at war with his own orders. The two are now intertwined. "Tell me," she demanded, her voice no longer pleading but firm, resolute. "I have spent months waiting in silence, followed by days of believing the worst. I will not be protected by ignorance any longer. I have a right to know what has happened to the man I was supposed to marry." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her face as if assessing her strength, her fortitude. He seemed to come to a decision. "What I am about to tell you cannot leave this room. It is a matter of state security. Treason, do you understand?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Treason?" He nodded grimly. Julian was not merely a lieutenant, enjoying the peace in Paris. He was an agent for the crown. His charm and social standing gave him access to circles of disgruntled French nobility, Bonapartists who still dream of overthrowing King Louis and restoring the empire. He was gathering intelligence on their plots. Eleanor sank onto a nearby settee, her knees suddenly weak. Julian, a spy? It seemed impossible. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a man who loved poetry and abhorred deceit. 3 weeks ago, the Duke continued, his voice low and urgent, his communications ceased. We received intelligence from another source that his cover was compromised. He has been taken by a group led by a man named Le Corbeau, the Crow, a ruthless fanatic who believes Julian knows the location of a ledger containing the names of all their English sympathizers and financial backers. "My God," Eleanor breathed. Is he being tortured?" The Duke's expression hardened. "Le Corbeau is not known for his hospitality. We believe he is being held somewhere in the north of France, but his captors are clever. They know we are looking for him. And they know about you." Eleanor looked up, her heart seizing with fear. "Me? You are his known weakness, Miss Vance? His fiancée. They believe that if they cannot break him, they can use you as leverage. We intercepted a message suggesting they were planning to send agents to England to abduct you." Suddenly everything clicked into place. The Duke's sudden appearance, the storm, a convenient excuse to stay. The forged letter, a brutal but effective tool to publicly sever their connection, to make her seem like a jilted lover with no connection to Julian, thereby lessening her value as a hostage. His warning, "The storm has not passed. You would be wise to bar your doors," was not a metaphor. It was a literal warning. "You're not a messenger," she said, her voice filled with dawning realization. "You're a bodyguard." My orders were to neutralize the threat to you, he confirmed. The letter was deemed the most efficient way. It was supposed to make you hate him, to make you sever all emotional ties. It would make my task of protecting you simpler if you were compliant. Simpler, she repeated, a fresh wave of anger rising. You stood there and watched my heart break for the sake of simplicity. I followed my orders, he bit out, a flash of frustration in his eyes. Orders that I argued against. I told my superiors that you would see through the forgery, that underestimating a woman's intuition was a fool's errand. They did not listen. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound weariness. I did not enjoy the task, Miss Vant, I assure you. For the first time, she saw past the Iron Duke, past the soldier, and saw the man. A man burdened by duty, forced to commit acts of calculated cruelty in the service of a greater good. The new reality was terrifying, but it was infinitely better than the one she had been living in. Julian was not a faithless lover. He was a hero in peril. And she was not a victim of a broken heart. She was a target. "The ledger," she said, her mind working furiously. "The one Le Corbeau is looking for. Does Julian know where it is?" "We don't know," the Duke admitted. "If he does, he hasn't broken. But he did send one last, heavily coded message before he was taken. It was mostly indecipherable, but it contained 3 words we could understand. Blackwood, Eleanor, sanctuary." Eleanor stared at him, bewildered. "Me? What do I have to do with it?" "We believe he hid something here," the Duke said, his gaze sweeping the room. "Something vital. A key, a map, perhaps even the ledger itself. He sent it to you before his correspondence was cut off, hidden in a way you wouldn't recognize. Le Corbeau's agents are not just coming for you. They are coming for whatever Julian entrusted to your care. Her home, her sanctuary, was now the center of a deadly conspiracy. She thought back over the last few months, over Julian's letters, the gifts he had sent. A book of sonnets, a pressed flower, a small, intricately carved wooden box. Had she missed something? "We must search," she said, her fear solidifying into resolve. "We must find it before they do." The Duke nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "We must." At that moment, the drawing-room doors flew open. It was Corporal Jones, his face pale, his hand on the pistol tucked into his belt. "Your Grace," he said, his voice tense. "Riders approaching. 3 of them. They are not locals." Bryce Beaumont was across the room in an instant, his saber already in his hand, the steel whispering as it left the scabbard. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the gap in the heavy curtains. "They fly the colors of a local magistrate," he murmured, his voice tight with suspicion. "Too convenient. It's them." He turned to Eleanor, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Go upstairs. Bar your door, and do not open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Eleanor, her heart pounding, nodded. The danger he had spoken of was no longer a distant threat in France. It was here. It had ridden through the rain and was now at their door. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Eleanor's throat, but she forced it down. The Duke's command had been absolute, his eyes burning with an urgency that left no room for fear. She turned and fled the room, her slippers silent on the grand staircase. Behind her, she heard the Duke issuing low, rapid-fire orders to Corporal Jones and the few able-bodied male servants in the house. She reached her room, her hand trembling as she turned the heavy iron key in the lock. The click echoed in the silent hallway. She pressed her ear to the thick oak door, her body thrumming with a terrifying mixture of fear and a strange, wild exhilaration. She was no longer a passive spectator in her own life. Downstairs, She heard the heavy thud of the front door bar being dropped into place, followed by her father's reedy, panicked voice demanding to know what was happening. The Duke's reply was a low, inaudible rumble. Then, a loud, authoritative knock sounded at the front door. "Open in the name of the King's magistrate," a voice called out, laced with a faint but discernible French accent. A tense silence followed. Eleanor held her breath. "We have a warrant to search these premises for a fugitive," the voice shouted again, more impatiently this time. "Open the door, or we will force it." Eleanor's gaze darted around her room. Sanctuary. He hid something here. Her eyes fell upon the small collection of keepsakes from Julian, arranged on her writing desk. The book of sonnets, the pressed rose, and the small, carved wooden box he had sent her for her birthday 3 months ago. She had loved the box for its craftsmanship. It was made of dark, polished walnut, with a delicate silver bird inlaid on the lid. She had never thought of it as anything more than a pretty container for her hairpins. Her fingers trembling, she picked it up. It felt solid, seamless. She ran her thumb over the silver bird. One of its wings seemed to be set at a slightly different angle from the other. On a desperate impulse, she pressed down on it. A faint click sounded from within the box. A tiny, almost invisible seam appeared along the base. She pried it open with her fingernail, revealing not a hollow bottom, but a tightly folded piece of vellum, thin as onion skin. It was covered in what looked like gibberish, a complex cipher of letters and numbers, and tucked within its folds was a small, ornate, strangely shaped brass key. A crash from downstairs made her jump, dropping the key with a clatter. It was the sound of splintering wood. The front door. They were inside. She heard a man shout in French, followed by the unmistakable deafening roar of a pistol shot. Her blood ran cold. She quickly scooped up the key and the vellum, her mind racing. She couldn't let them find this. Looking around wildly, her eyes landed on the heavy velvet curtains that flanked her window. She slipped the key and the paper into a deep seam in the lining, praying it would be safe. The sounds from below grew more frantic. Shouts, the clash of steel, the heavy thud of a body falling. She could hear the Duke's voice, not shouting, but a controlled, lethal roar as he commanded the defense. He was not a man of drawing rooms and polite conversation. He was a creature of the battlefield, and the battle had come to him. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fighting seemed to move through the house, from the main hall towards the west wing. Then she heard footsteps pounding up the stairs. Heavy, urgent steps. Were they coming for her? She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, grabbing a heavy silver letter opener from her desk. A pathetic weapon, but the only one she had. The footsteps stopped outside her door. The handle rattled violently. "Eleanor!" It was the Duke's voice, strained but powerful. "Open the door." With a sob of relief, she scrambled to the door and fumbled with the key. The lock turned, and she threw the door open. Bryce Beaumont stood there, his face grim, a smudge of gunpowder on his cheek. In one hand he held his saber, its tip stained crimson. In the other, a pistol. Corporal Jones was behind him, reloading his own weapon with frantic speed. "Are you harmed?" the Duke demanded, his eyes scanning her quickly. "No," she breathed. "I found it. A false bottom in the wooden box, a cipher and a key." His eyes widened in triumph, but there was no time to celebrate. A shout from downstairs announced that their enemies were regrouping. "They're too many," he said grimly. "We cannot hold the house. We have to get you out." He looked past her, towards the window. "Is there a way to the stables from the gardens?" "Yes," she said. "The trellis. It runs from my balcony down to the rose garden. It's old, but it might hold." "It will have to," he said. He turned to his man. "Jones, hold this stairwell. Give us 5 minutes. Then fall back to the east woods. We'll meet you there if we can." The corporal nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Aye, Your Grace." Bryce turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "I know you are afraid, but I need you to be brave now. Can you do that?" She met his gaze and found not a cold commander, but a man placing his trust in her. She lifted her chin. "Yes." He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Come." He led her to the balcony doors, unlatched them, and peered out into the damp, grey dawn. The rain had stopped. The trellis, thick with dormant rose vines, looked perilously fragile. Below, the garden was shrouded in mist. "Go," he urged. "I will be right behind you." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She swung a leg over the balcony railing, her skirts tangling around her ankles. Her hands found a hold on the cold, wet wood of the trellis. She started to climb down, the old structure groaning in protest. Splinters dug into her palms. She dared not look down. She could hear the sounds of the fight resuming inside, the crack of another pistol shot. She focused only on her next handhold, her next foothold. The Duke's presence, a steadying force just above her. She was halfway down when a man appeared in the garden below, looking up. He raised his pistol. Eleanor froze, a perfect target. Before he could fire, there was a blur of motion from the balcony above. Bryce Beaumont did not climb. He launched himself from the balcony, his large frame crashing into the trellis beside her. The structure shuddered violently, but his momentum carried him downward. He landed on the man below with the force of an avalanche, a sickening crunch echoing in the misty air. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling her the rest of the way down. "Run!" he commanded, grabbing her hand again and pulling her towards the high stone wall that separated the garden from the stables. The chase was on. They ran, hand in hand, through the manicured rose garden. The damp earth soaked Eleanor's thin slippers, and thorny vines tore at her skirts, but she didn't feel it. Adrenaline was afire in her veins. Bryce moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his head on a swivel, his saber held ready. He was leading her towards a small, heavy oak door, set into the garden's far wall, a servant's entrance to the stable yard. Shouts erupted from the house behind them. Their escape had been spotted. Bryce glanced back. "They're coming!" He pushed her towards the gate. "Get it open, quickly!" The gate was bolted from their side with a thick, rusty iron bolt. Eleanor's cold, numb fingers struggled with the stiff mechanism. It wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" she cried in frustration. Bryce didn't waste a moment. "Stand back!" He reversed his grip on his saber and slammed the heavy pommel against the bolt. Once. Twice. On the third blow, the rusted metal shrieked and gave way. He threw the gate open and shoved her through into the relative safety of the stable yard. His great black stallion, Ares, whinnied from a nearby stall, sensing his master's urgency. Two men, the agents who had been guarding the front, rounded the corner of the house, pistols raised. Bryce moved to intercept them, placing himself between them and Eleanor. "Saddle him!" he yelled over his shoulder. "Now!" While Bryce engaged the two men in a deadly dance of steel, Eleanor raced to Ares's stall. Her hands, more accustomed to embroidery needles than leather straps, fumbled with the heavy saddle. She had ridden all her life, but never with such desperate haste. The saddle was a dead weight, but she managed to heave it onto the stallion's broad back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the sounds were sharp and brutal, a grunt of pain, the wet slide of a blade. She risked a glance. One of the men was on the ground. The other, a burly man with a scarred face, was pressing Bryce hard, his own sword a blur of silver. She tightened the cinch on the saddle, just as Bryce disarmed his opponent with a powerful twist of his wrist. He didn't kill the man. Instead, he delivered a precise, disabling blow with the hilt of his sword to the man's temple. The henchman crumpled to the ground. Bryce was at her side in 3 long strides, his chest heaving. "Is he ready?" "Yes," she panted. He didn't waste time with formalities. He laced his fingers together, creating a step. Up. Eleanor placed her foot in his hands, and he launched her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing. He swung himself up behind her, his powerful body a solid wall at her back. His arm wrapped around her waist, holding her securely as he took the reins. "Hold on," he growled in her ear, his voice a low vibration that shot through her entire body. He spurred Ares into motion. The great horse surged forward, clearing the stable-yard gate in a single, powerful bound. They thundered onto the open moor, leaving Blackwood Manor and the chaos behind them. The mist was thick here, a blessing that cloaked their escape. Bryce urged the horse on, his focus absolute, his presence enveloping her. Eleanor leaned back against him, her cheek brushing the rough wool of his coat. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back, a rhythm that was strong and sure in a world that had come undone. They rode hard for what felt like an hour, the moorland a blur of grey mist and purple heather. Bryce seemed to navigate by instinct, finally slowing the horse in the shelter of a small, dense copse of ancient pines. He slid from the saddle and reached up to help her down. His hand spanned her waist, and for a moment, after her feet touched the ground, he did not let go. They stood there, surrounded by the quiet of the woods, the mist swirling around them. The adrenaline of the chase began to fade, leaving a raw, quivering awareness in its place. His eyes, no longer cold steel but dark, stormy grey, searched her face. "You were brave back there, Eleanor," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He used her first name, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. "I had to be," she whispered, her gaze locked with his. "Julian was right to trust you," he murmured, his thumb brushing unconsciously against her side. "He knew your strength, even when you did not." The mention of Julian was a stark reminder of their purpose, yet it felt distant. The man who held her now, the man who had ridden through a storm, fought for her, and shielded her with his own body, felt more real, more present than the memory of the man she thought she loved. In the past few days, Bryce Beaumont had shown her who he was, not just the Iron Duke, but a man of honor, courage, and a fierce, protective loyalty that ran deeper than mere duty. And she realized, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that her heart, which she thought had been broken, was not broken at all. It had simply been waiting for him. Slowly, as if closing a great distance, he lowered his head. The world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of rain, pine, and the clean, masculine scent of him. His lips met hers, not with the gentle sweetness she had known from Julian, but with a firm, searching pressure that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. It was a kiss that was not a beginning, but a recognition. A silent, mutual acknowledgement of the powerful, undeniable thing that had grown between them in the heart of the storm. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with an emotion she could not name, but that she felt echoed in her own soul. "We need to get the cipher to London," he said, his voice rough. "The key. What does it look like?" Still reeling from the kiss, Eleanor reached into the seam of her dress and pulled out the small brass object. She held it out on her palm. Bryce stared at it, a look of stunned recognition on his face. "I know this key," he breathed. "It is not for a lock. It is for a cipher machine. My father, The old Duke designed it. There are only two in existence. One is in the War Office in London. The other, he paused, his eyes meeting hers with grim understanding, is in the library at Blackwood Castle. My home. 10 miles from here. The sanctuary Julian had named was not the manor. It was the Duke himself. Blackwood Castle was a fortress of granite and shadow, a silent statement of power against the grey sea. Bryce led Eleanor through a hidden door and directly to the vast library, where a section of shelving swung open to reveal a small, secret chamber. Inside was a complex machine of polished brass and mahogany, the cipher machine. "The key," he said, his voice taut. With the vellum and the key she had found, he worked with practiced efficiency. The machine clicked and whirred, translating Julian's desperate, silent message. Finally, a slip of paper emerged. Bryce read it, his face hardening into a mask of grim finality. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered. "Where is he?" "An abandoned monastery in Normandy," Bryce said, his voice flat. He handed her the paper. It contained the location, a list of traitors' names, and a final, heart-wrenching order from Julian. "Bryce, if you read this, they have me. The list is the priority, not my life. Let them have me. Protect England. And protect her." "His orders are clear," Bryce said, turning away from her. "My duty is to take this list to the War Office. Julian is a soldier. He knew the risks." "So you'll abandon him?" Eleanor cried, stepping in front of him. "You who spoke of courage? You called Julian a coward for sending you to face a storm he could not. Will you now hide behind duty because you are afraid to face this one? What does your heart tell you to do, Bryce?" Her words struck him like a physical blow. He stood frozen, the soldier warring with the man who had kissed her in the woods. The Iron Duke, who followed orders without question, and Bryce, who had launched himself from a balcony to shield her from a bullet. He looked at her then, the conflict in his steel eyes resolving into a clear, unwavering fire. He had made his choice. "Corporal Jones will ride for London with the list," he declared, his voice ringing with renewed purpose. "My place is in Normandy." He moved with sudden urgency, dispatching his orders. Then he returned to her, framing her face with his hands. "I am not Julian, Eleanor. I make no promises I cannot keep. I will come back for you." He kissed her, a deep, searing kiss filled with the weight of his vow. It was not a goodbye, but a promise of return. He left her standing on the battlements, the sea wind whipping at her hair. She watched him ride out, not from a window of sorrowful waiting, but from the strong walls of a fortress. Her vigil was no longer one of hope, but of faith. She was not waiting for a letter that might never come. She was waiting for the Duke, her Duke, to ride home from the storm. From a silent vigil filled with hopeless longing, a love story of immense courage was born. Eleanor Vance's world was shattered, not by a lover's betrayal, but by a hero's sacrifice, and rebuilt by the arrival of a Duke who was more than a legend. He was a man of duty, forced to make an impossible choice between his country and his conscience, between orders and the urgings of his own heart. In the end, he rode into another storm, not of rain and wind, but of swords and shadows, all for the woman who had shown him that true strength lies not in unbending resolve, but in the courage to choose love. What did you think of the Duke's decision? Was it honor or love that drove him in the end? Let us know in the comments below. If you were captivated by Eleanor and Bryce's story, please give this video a like, share it with a friend who loves epic romance, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love against all odds.